This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here, we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We're really excited today to get to speak with Adina Popescu, who is executive editor at Yale University Press. Her books there have been awarded over 70 prizes, including the Bancroft Prize, the National Book Award in Nonfiction, the Mark Linden History Prize, the George Washington Prize, the Frederick Douglass Prize, and Best Books of the Year from The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, Publishers Weekly, and Publishers Marketplace, among others. And Adina, I noticed on your website you have this great screen of, I guess, many, if not all of your books. I don't know if that's common for academic press editors to have that kind of website where they feature the books they've edited. What made you do that?
Well, it's just a nice thing to show authors and potential authors, because I often get asked, well, what do you work on? What are your books? What are you excited about? So it's nice to have a place to just send them to, and they can explore the variety of books that I've published.
It looks great. Can you tell us about the kind of books you seek out?
Yeah. So I always look, what everybody looks for, the best historical research that is being conducted and written today. I always look for books that change the conversation in a field, and also in a perfect world that speak to the broadest possible audience of readers. But also, and I think this is the part that's sometimes mysterious to potential authors, is that it's important to us that we bring on books that we know that we can publish well. And so there are lots of good books out there that might not be a great fit for us, that we might not be a good match for. So it's important for there to be sort of, the closest possible alignment. And for us, that's a mix of titles. And so I will look sometimes for groundbreaking monographs in certain very specific fields that we are strong in. I also look for research-based academic books that are written for broader audiences than just the specialists and whatever the subfield is, and that might also cross over somewhat to a non-specialist audience. And finally, I also looked for research-based books that are really written for a broad audience, that are geared towards that non-scholarly audience, with perhaps also an undergraduate course audience later on.
Can you tell those kinds of things just from that cover letter or the query that you get from an author?
Not always. Often you can sort of tell what direction a book is going to go in. Often a book will fall somewhere at the intersection of those categories, which are not sort of set in stone. And often a conversation with an author helps to clarify, first of all, what the author is trying to do and who the author is trying to reach. And it's always important for me to make sure that the author knows who they're talking to, and that we are fully supportive of that conversation, and that we can support it.
You mentioned earlier you're looking for a close alignment. Is that an alignment with what Yale University Press is trying to do currently with its list?
Well, yes. So, like I said, we look for a mix of books, and it's important that I get the right mix for my list. So, a certain number of monographs, a certain number of trade books, a certain number of crossover books. And so that partly informs my decision on whether or not to take a particular project. It's not just that a book has to be good or a project has to be good, because unfortunately I have to turn down a lot of good books.
Does that mean it might be, I've already done this many Latin American history and I just can't do another? Or what would be sort of the good book that gets rejected?
It could be that we have too many books in a particular area. It could be that we don't, maybe a book is interdisciplinary in a way that we don't reach both disciplines or all disciplines equally. That might be something that would keep us from taking a very good book. Or it might be that I just can't take any more monographs this year. It could be any number of those things.
Yeah, you mentioned authors who are aiming for a trade or crossover. These are categories we've often talked about on this podcast. And I know many academic authors are seeking or want to see their books as either trade or crossover. And I'm just curious, I assume it's not just a matter of the author saying, "I am writing this as a crossover book." What convinces you that it is, in fact?
Yeah, I mean, there are actually many factors that go into that, and I should also say that I'm not the only decider. There are a lot of people at the press involved in figuring out what category a book falls into, and the author doesn't often see a lot of those other people, but they're there, and that conversation is very much a live one. But there are many factors. So one is this a topic that regular people are interested in? Does it connect to something in the news perhaps, or something live, or is it an evergreen topic of some sort? Is the author saying something new and interesting about this topic that regular people want to know about? And I think a lot of academic work is actually very, very valuable, but it won't be of interest to a broad audience, and that's fine too. But we have to be clear minded about those cases. Is the author out in public? This is a pretty important one. Do they have what we call the dreaded public platform? I know that a lot of authors hate hearing this term, but it's important that if you are speaking to a broad audience, that you are actually doing that all the time, not just sort of coming out of nowhere with one book. So are you writing op-eds? Are you giving lectures? Do you have a public profile, and are you recognized as an expert on this topic? Because part of what makes a book successful is that people have to recognize the author as an expert, somebody who quote unquote owns this topic in some sense. So all of those factors go into that. And of course, is it written in such a way that it's accessible to people who are not professional readers like we are?
Right. And those all seem like things you might actually get an idea of from a query letter.
You can. Query letters in general are very, very short, and I
Mhm.
encourage people to keep them short. It should be about a paragraph outlining what your major question is and what your answer is also, and who you are. And a query letter should only really spark a conversation. Or it might result in me saying, that's probably not for us, but you might want to try X, Y, and Z other publishers. But yes, you can often tell in a query letter, and it's important that the author be clear in their own mind, like I said, what they're doing, what audience they are speaking to.
The issue of the platform that you mentioned, I assume that many writers who are writing op-eds for the New York Times or the Washington Post would maybe wanna mention that in the query letter, but is it common for editors to maybe just kinda Google and see, "Oh, is this person writing for the popular press too?"
Absolutely. Yes, I will Google people,
Mhm.
always see who they are if I don't already know them. Yes. But it does help if you mention that in your query letter. I'm professor of history at so and so. I've written X, Y, and Z books, and I've appeared regularly on whatever media, You can keep it short.
Right. Yeah. What other factors in that initial query letter influence your interest or lack of interest in the project or the author?
Well, first of all, is it an area in which we publish? So that is the first thing. And if it's not, then I will tell the author right away, this is probably not for us because this is not a core area for us. That is really the primary consideration. And then from then on, what kind of a book is it? Is it going to be a hyper specialized book? Is that the kind of book that I'm looking for right now? Or do I think, for whatever reason, this person might be better off somewhere else? If it is an excellent book that I think is maybe not right for us right now, which happens a lot.
I know many of my academic colleagues wonder how many queries or book proposals you or your assistant might be getting a week or a month, what the numbers are actually like. Can you give us an idea?
Yeah, so it varies between, I would say between 5 and 15 a week, and I can take about 15 to 20 books a year. So that gives you a bit of a sense that I have to say no a lot. But I will also contextualize that by saying that my contact info is publicly available, so anybody can send me a book idea. So within those, 5 to 15 a week, that includes books that are plausible and good, and that includes just random people sending me their ideas for memoirs and family histories and, you know, any number of things.
Yeah. I also know academics wonder if there are benefits or disadvantages to approaching folks like you, editors, at these book exhibit halls that we have at all of our academic conferences. What do you think?
Yes, so I go to conferences, and it's actually a great opportunity to meet people and just talk to people. And I always encourage people to reach out to editors if you're going to a conference. And what you should do is write a query letter, maybe, anywhere from 6 weeks to 2 weeks before the actual conference. write just a quick note and say, I'm working on X topic. This is who I am. I'm going to be at the AHA conference. Do you have time to meet? And if it's a subject or a book that seems plausible for us, I will meet with the person. And it's usually a half hour chat over coffee, or, it's very informal, in which they can tell me a bit about what they're doing, the audience that they're hoping to reach, the status of the project. And they can also ask any questions that they want about publishing. We love to talk about books, and I speak for my fellow editors at other presses. We love talking about books. We love talking about research. We love talking about our work. So this is your chance to really just ask us anything about how publishing works, what we do, what we might do with a book like yours, any number of things. And I encourage people to do it also because editors are around for a long time, for probably for a big part of your career, and it's good to know us, even if this particular project might not be a good fit for this particular editor. Your next book might be. You might be somebody that I might want to ask to read things for us. There are long-term relationships that develop between editors and potential authors, and it's good. It's good for us to know each other, and the conference is the perfect time to do that. So, if you're wondering whether that's something you should do, do it.
And I know academics also wonder. I've pitched this editor in the past. He wasn't interested, and maybe you feel sort of like I shouldn't approach him again. But it sounds like from what you're telling me that just because they weren't interested in one project doesn't mean you shouldn't try again with something else.
Absolutely. Yes. Just because we didn't take one project doesn't mean that we might not be interested in a future project. And I often tell people this when I turn something down. I'll say, hopefully we'll get to work on something else in the future. I mean, there are many reasons why we turn projects down. It's not personal. It's not that we never want to talk to you again. It's just that that one at that time didn't work out for whatever reason.
And do editors? I guess this question is sparked in part by memory. I was at a American Religion Conference, and it was sort of shocking to see like three of the editors from three of the major presses chatting together. And I realized, oh, wait, they might know each other. Maybe they're actually in touch about authors or project or just what's going on. Do you talk to editors at other presses in your fields?
Absolutely. We all know each other. And often we know each other well because often we've worked at other places together before our current jobs. It's a very, very small world. If you think academia is like your subfield is a small world, this is way smaller. So, yes, we do know each other. We talk about all sorts of things. I would say we probably don't, if you submit to three of us and you see the three of us chatting, we're probably not talking about you or your book. We tend not to talk about books that are currently under that all of us might be considering for various reasons, but that doesn't really come up. But yes, we absolutely do know each other, and many of us are friends.
Are there better or worse time of years to query a editor to pitch a book?
That's a really funny question because I often wonder if there are better or worse times in which to ask people to read for me. I will go through great lengths to kind of game that out. Like, well, can't do it the first week in September because everybody's starting their semesters. You can't do it right at the end because everybody's grading and so on. And so what you come out with is that there's no really good time, so you might as well just do it.
Right.
I think for pitching books to editors, the timing is not quite as cut and dry. So, yes, it doesn't really make a difference. I mean, there are going to be times of the year when we are extremely busy, but you would not know what those times would be. So, just send it whenever you're ready and hope for the best.
One of the areas that remains mysterious to a lot of academics is what happens when your book manuscript gets presented to an editorial board of a press. I know I've sort of imagined that your editor is kind of like your lawyer representing you, maybe taking questions. What goes on? What is this meeting like?
Yeah, that's a good question because nobody gets to see that part. And I'll start by saying that there are actually two different processes that are called, quote, editorial board, and they're quite different. And one of them is internal. So this is the people who work at the press. And the other one is usually a faculty board. So most university presses will have a set of faculty, part of whose service work is serving on a board that approves books. So I'll talk about those two processes differently because they are actually different. So before we offer a contract, your project will go to an internal editorial board where, yes, in many ways, I am like your advocate, like your lawyer, except that the people in that room are the people who employ me, actually. So the relationship is a little bit different than that. But so usually in that room will be the other editors, the other acquisitions editors from other fields, but also the director of sales, the director of marketing, the director of publicity, the director of the entire press, the director of production. And when I present your book, I will talk about the content of the book, why it's important from a scholarly point of view, why it's a good fit for our list, why I think we can sell it really well, why I think we can produce it really well, why I think this is the perfect person to write this particular book. What the news and publicity hooks I think it's going to have once it publishes, and everybody else in the room kind of weighs in on this, and their opinions are very important. Everybody has to kind of buy into the project as something that we can do well. And so part of my job is to get them to buy into it. And another very important aspect of this meeting is that we sort of do an estimate of what we're going to spend on this book and how much we're going to earn on this book. So, an important question is, are we going to come out in the red or are we going to come out ahead? We make these guesses for every single book at several points of its life. So all of these questions come into the conversation. And the thing to be decided at this meeting is, what kind of a book is this? Is this going to be a trade book? Is this going to be a monograph? Is this going to be a crossover book? How much do we think it's going to sell to the best of our knowledge? What should we price it at? How long is it going to be? Who are the buyers going to be for this book? And how do we reach them? If this is a book on which we're going to lose money, what does it do for us? And we do actually often, we will sign up books knowing that they're going to lose money, and that's fine. But in that case, what's it going to do for us as a press? Is it going to win major prizes and it's going to launch somebody's career? Is it going to bring other great books to us? This is all part of that conversation. And what comes out at the end is an offer that we make to you, a financial offer and an offer to publish a book a certain way. So the contractual terms, all of that gets decided at this point in this meeting.
This first internal board sounds like it would be a pretty positive. I mean, I'm just guessing there's not that many editors, say, at Yale. I'm imagining this as it being unusual for a book not to make it through, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
It's unusual, but it does happen sometimes. Sometimes there's disagreement, and sometimes an editor is very attached to a project, and everybody else says, well, maybe you're not being realistic about what this really is. It's rare, but I have seen it happen probably a couple of times a year. So you're right that it doesn't happen very often. Yeah, but it does happen.
And you mentioned there's another kind of board meeting.
Yeah, so university presses, all of them also have a faculty board. And the faculty board process comes up much later in the life of the book, at least at Yale. And at many places, it comes up once the book is already finished. It's written, it's had its final round of reviews, and we need the faculty board to say, yes, this book passes the review process. And this process is much more focused on the content of the book and on the content of the reviews. The faculty has nothing to say about the financial investment in the book, how much it's going to sell. All of that's all up to us. Their job is just to vet the book from a scholarly point of view. And so what they do is we usually have each book reviewed by two outside readers, and the faculty board gets a little write up from me about what the project is, and they actually read the reviews and the author's response to the reviews. And I give them it's a meeting that takes place in person, and I'll give them a little spiel to start with. I'll describe the book. I'll say, well, the reviewer said this and this. Maybe the author's going to make a few final revisions, and then they discuss. This is a meeting where almost every book passes. It's sort of like a dissertation defense where your advisor will not let you do it unless they think you're going to pass. So books almost always pass. There are a few exceptions even here, but it's very rare that a book will not pass if it's brought to this meeting.
I know academic authors are often unsure of, is their book going back to the reviewers who did the readers' reports after they've made the revisions or not? And maybe that varies, but what is your understanding of what happens?
Well, it depends. So if we found the first round of reviews very helpful, and this includes if the author found them helpful, then we'll try to go back to those first reviewers. But often the time span between the first round of review and the last round of review is very long. So even if we want the initial reviewers, they're not always available when we need them to be. So, if the reviewers are helpful, we'll try to get them again. If they're available, great. If not, then we'll have to find other reviewers. So it's not a process we can fully control because people have to be available and they don't work for us exactly. Although we do pay them, unlike journals, book publishers pay reviewers.
And we've also had guests who've shared that they have sometimes had additional reports requested at some stage of review, and a reason isn't always given. But what's your understanding of why sometimes more than those two are needed?
Well, sometimes if I think that the faculty board is going to raise an eyebrow or raise questions with the reviews that we have, for example, if one reviewer is very positive but the other might be very, very critical, I might want to get a third reviewer. Not so much as a tiebreaker, but just to reassure the faculty board that this is good to go. When I get a third reviewer, an additional reviewer, it's always to help the author out and in order to help them pass those final hurdles. And sometimes, it's also they might need to make additional revisions, but that's important to know before the book is out there in the world and the book is reviewed in journals and in public. So the review process is actually very important. And even though I realize that it can be annoying, it's your friend.
Right. You've probably read so many readers' reports by now. I wonder if you can give us an idea of what you think academics could be doing better, or what is helpful when they do a good job of these reports.
Well, I have read a lot of reports. I've commissioned many hundreds, maybe more of reports during my career. And I'm always amazed at the amount of care and labor that people put into other people's work. It's incredibly labor intensive to give detailed reviews, and some people just do an incredible job. I would say the most important thing is real, actual engagement with the work. That is the most helpful thing. You know, People are different, and so sometimes, the tone of reviews can throw some people off, but I always advise people, ignore the tone. Just focus on the substance and focus on what you can take away from this. I know it's hard to do sometimes because sometimes people are not polite and they don't always couch their, criticisms with praise. Sometimes they do, but not always. But even if they don't, just consider this as engagement with your work that helps you make it stronger. Even if you think the reviewer is wrong, if you feel like they've misread your work, then think about how you can restate it so that other people don't misread it in the same way, rather than thinking, well, this isn't useful because this person hasn't understood what I was trying to say. Think about saying it better. So always, use the review process to your advantage.
Yeah, that's great advice for getting the most out of that process. I know you've worked at a few different presses, so I wonder what you can tell us about your perspective on how Yale is different.
I have worked at many different presses, and there's a whole sort of universe of publishers that publish academic books, and they range from commercial presses, places like FSG or Basic, or even the big ones like Penguin, Knopf, places like that, to the really huge university presses, the multinationals like Oxford and Cambridge, which are very different than the smaller university presses. They're sort of the trade-oriented university presses like Yale, Harvard, Chicago, Princeton. And then there are the smaller presses that publish a lot more monographic works. They're all a little bit different from each other. They all have different strengths in terms of what subjects they do best. This is a very important one. What kinds of readers they reach best. They differ in terms of whether or not they even do peer review, a pretty crucial consideration for, I think, a lot of scholars, whether they're for profit or nonprofit. I encourage people to think about this a lot. Where does the money come from to make their books and where does it go? More importantly. So Yale is sort of a trade oriented academic press. We do monographs, but our sweet spot is those books that reach out beyond the specialist audience. We are, unlike some of the other places that I've worked, we're a very boutique. I like to describe it as a boutique press because we place great value on things like copy editing, making a beautiful book, a high quality book, something that people will want to buy and that will last as a physical object. We do a lot of bespoke publicity. We get books reviewed in places like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Review of Books. And these are decisions that publishers make on how to spend the resources that are available to them. It takes an enormous amount of work to get books reviewed like that. It doesn't just sort of happen. You don't just put a book out and it gets picked up. There are people who are pushing these things all the time. Making a beautiful quality book is also a resource allocation decision. And other publishers have decided to focus their resources in other ways. But I would say that that's what sets us apart. We make beautiful books that people want to read and that break academic scholarship out of the academy and bring it out into the world.
Academics, I know, also wonder as they move past their first book, is there Is there a different way that my second or third book will be considered by an editor or a press? Are you looking at what happened with the first book? Are you looking at sales? What happens once you're past that first book stage in terms of how you, the editor, and the press weighs and considers this next project?
Yeah, that's a good question. The real difference is how we consider that first book, because often we don't have anything to go on. On the first book, it's most often a revised dissertation, emphasis on revised because we don't publish on revised dissertation. So your first book should be a book based on your dissertation that seeks to make it legible to a broader audience than your dissertation, which is really, let's face it, written probably for a group of, 6 people who are on your committee. Even for first books, we look at competing sales. We always look at competing. This is a really big part of that first editorial meeting is we look at other books on similar topics and how they've done. If you don't have any other books that you have published before, of course, we don't have that data. For your subsequent books, we do have that data, and we do look at how your first book sold. We will also look at things like, did you get any prizes? Were you out in public? What kind of attention did the book get? Your first book get? Things like that. For second books, and especially for books after tenure, people tend to have a lot more freedom in terms of what they can do. And I think a lot of authors find this very liberating, and some of them find it a little bit paralyzing because all of a sudden they could do anything. But yeah, we do look at how your first book did in considering whether to take on subsequent books. And we also understand that if your first book is a very narrow book, that we will take those sales figures in that context.
That's interesting to hear that you might consider if an author was kind of out in public with a book or doing book events. Is that sort of a sign that this author actually takes some responsibility for maybe trying to get the book out there? Is that a attractive quality for a potential author?
Yeah, absolutely. It suggests that this person has a readership. And that's a question that we ask ourselves. Does this person have an audience that they can grow with this next project? Are they the kind of person who likes to be out there, who really makes an effort to be out there? It helps if you are, certainly with book sales. But we also recognize that not everybody is like that. Not everybody likes to be out there, and that's fine too. At the end of the day, it's the quality of the work that really matters.
You've been in publishing for a while, as you mentioned, so I'm curious on your perspective on what's changed or what's important in academic publishing now that maybe wasn't as important. Probably some of this public facing you're mentioning, and the platform is part of that. But can you tell us your impressions?
Yeah, so I've been in publishing since 1994, and my first job in publishing, and I was still an undergraduate at that time, was to help editors and authors use word processing rather than hard copy. So a lot has changed since then. But aside from the mechanics of how we write books and how we make books, I think what has really changed is the market for academic books has changed drastically. So it used to be back when I started that you had pretty much a guaranteed sale for any academic book because the academic libraries would just buy a copy. And you could bank on that money and you could sort of figure out how much money you were going to make, which means you knew how much money you could spend and come out pretty much even at the end, which is our goal as a nonprofit, of course. That was much easier to do. That doesn't really exist anymore, and hasn't, I would say. It's decreased since probably the very late 90s. We don't have those guaranteed sales anymore. A lot of libraries aren't routinely buying everything that an academic publisher puts out anymore. So that's been a big change. The other big change, and this has happened much more rapidly in very recent years, is that there aren't as many outlets that review serious books. There used to be every local newspaper used to have a dedicated book review staff and section, and that's almost completely gone. And that makes book publicity a lot more difficult. Books with regional appeal used to get reliably reviewed in regional newspapers. Of course, there aren't really regional newspapers anymore, much less regional newspapers with book review sections. And so that makes authors getting out there all the more important and being active participants in the publicity process all the more important. So it has changed quite a bit.
And with what's been going on with, I guess, major publishing houses, in a way, this seems like a positive for academic presses. I feel like I notice more books coming out of the top university presses you mentioned, places like Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Chicago, that get attention and say briefly noted in the New Yorker or Wall Street Journal.
Mhm.
So that seems great that you guys are producing these books that I think used to go maybe more to some of the big trade presses and get attention.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So the other big change is that there used to be a lot more sort of mid-tier publishers that have since consolidated slowly into the big five and just kind of been sucked up by the giants, and they don't exist anymore. And of course the giants are interested mostly in books that sell as many copies as possible, books by politicians, books by stars, things like that. So that leaves the serious mid-list book more for us and a few other commercial publishers. But yes, it has given academic publishers more of a market share in that space.
On the level of writing, I know some of our guests have talked about noticing that chapters are getting shorter, perhaps, and maybe this is an attempt to move more into that crossover trade or appealing to non-academics. Anything like that you can explain to us about changes that you're seeing?
Well, I always encourage my authors to keep the chapters short if they're trying to reach a broad audience. People don't honestly, I think that people's reading skills are really different than they used to be. And maybe this is just me getting old, but I feel like people are not they really just don't have the reading skills or the attention spans that they might once have had. So my advice to authors is always, well, write a chapter that somebody can read in one sitting. And by somebody, I don't mean me or you or a colleague who is a professor, but it's somebody who is not a professional reader. I think that's how we have to think of it if we want to bring readers along with us. And it is important to me that we bring readers along. I mean, we are trying to communicate ideas to people, and so we have to communicate them in a way that they're ready to assimilate.
When I was preparing for our conversation, I noticed that you do some public facing events, maybe specifically for academics, kind of explaining the publishing world and what you do. First of all, our audience might wonder, can I invite Adina to my campus? So I'm curious to hear if this is something you like to do, and also what you are hoping to communicate, or what you find academics need to understand better about publishing.
Yes, please invite me to your campus to talk. I love to do that. I find that people don't know a lot about our business. It seems like a black box, a mystery, how we decide things, why we decide things. And I think I wouldn't say it's an adversarial relationship between us and prospective authors, but people are nervous. I mean, there's a lot riding on submissions and they don't really know what's going on. And so I've made it sort of my mission to try to go out there and explain to people how these decisions are made. And I love to talk about it. I love to talk about my job and I love to talk about what we do. I can come and talk about the financials of publishing, working with an agent, writing habits, how to turn a dissertation into a book, how to make, a big research project into a book and other articles. All of the stuff I think is really important to communicate out to the community of writers. And there's always new people coming into that community. So there's always a need to teach about this stuff, and I love teaching. So please have me out to your campus.
I'm curious if you've seen first-time authors do a good job of, I guess, being out there and getting the word out there about their books. I know so many of my colleagues wonder, is this worth my time to try to do bookstore events, even if they want to? And we wonder how some people are able to do a good job of it. Have you noticed anything?
Yes, so bookstore events are tough because bookstores have to be sure that they're going to make money from an event. And so from some books they might, and from others they might not. So if you don't get very far with that, it's not a big deal. I think the easier thing for academics to do is when your book comes out, or actually ideally a couple of months before your book comes out, start writing your friends at other departments and have them invite you out to give a talk as part of their seminar series, or whatever venues that they have for authors to come. And that's a good way of doing it. Just use your own contacts and your own networks and try to go out there and talk about your book.
We also had a question from a listener that I wanted to ask you, which is about letters of interest. The academics often need this either for a faculty review or tenure and promotion, or even applications for fellowships and grants to show this project that there's some interest. So is that something that before you reach the stage of contract, is reasonable or possible to ask an editor if they can somehow express interest in the project?
It's interesting because I think maybe you might get different answers from different editors working at different places. I know that I can't do that. What I can do is if a book is under contract, I will be happy to write your tenure review committee or your fellowship committee and state that. I cannot say that we're considering a book or anything like that because there's no actual formal relationship there that we can draw on. So I have to be careful about that. But I do routinely write to people's tenure committees to confirm that things are under contract or, things are about to be published or what have you. So once that relationship is formalized, I can do that.
That's helpful. Thank you. There's two questions we ask all guests. And one is there something you wish you had known about writing or publishing earlier in your career? If you want to answer this on behalf of authors or yourself, that is great.
Well, so I started my publishing career when I was 18, which I had various ideas about the glamour of a life in publishing, most of which have actually surprisingly enough borne out to be true. It's a great job. It's a job I love. I also have a PhD in history, so I've spent some time in academia. And what I love the most about this job is that it's not hyper specialized, and I get to read across a broad variety of subfields. And it's just such a privilege to be able to do that and to be able to help people write and to be able to help people connect with their audience and bring their research out. I think that's an incredibly important thing to do. And I'm really glad to be able to do it. In terms of what I wish I had known, sometimes I have to say I wish I had gone into a more lucrative field. But I think that might be true of a lot of
Yeah.
academics in the
Yeah.
humanities.
We do have some listeners who are grad students and they might be wondering, hearing you, gee, how do I know that I think this editing thing sounds like it might be a good line of work for me? What would you advise if someone's considering that?
Well, picking up from my last comment, I would advise you to consider the financial implications of a career in publishing. But the other thing, no, seriously, is that it's very small and that there just aren't that many jobs. I mean, we do all know each other, which means that there aren't that many of us, and that's something that you might want to consider. But somehow I made it. I made it in this field, and I'm very happy in it. So I can't discourage anybody else. But there aren't a ton of jobs available. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind.
And another question is whether there is a writing practice or habit that works for you or your authors that you know of.
Yes. So my most successful authors write every single day. So I once worked with a very famous sociologist who told me that he woke up at 4 a.m. every single day of his life and wrote, and he published several books a year. And I do think actually that engaging with your writing every single day, even if it's in a really small sense, tends to keep projects going and progressing because there's just so much going on for all of us, not just in the outside world, but with teaching and with our jobs, that it's very hard to keep projects from falling to the back burner. So that is my advice to you: is work on it, even if a tiny bit, every single day. Give yourself like half an hour a day if you don't have anything more, and that'll keep your book growing.
Thank you, Adina. This has been really helpful and fun.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This has been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.